Hello everybody. So I wanted to start a new series of just quick tips. I'll call it Future Poly Quick Tips, where we just have little lessons that are in 5 to 10 minutes, kind of explaining things that students have troubles with. Now, one of the issues when we're doing our architecture assignment is handling arches. So I wanted to give a couple pointers for that. First thing is, this is our placeholder texture. Remember, this is not our final, it's just dropping some photos in to figure out our UV layouts and what we want to do. For arches, it's really tempting just to put the entire kind of curve of the arch on the texture here. The problem is it takes a giant amount of space and it's not very usable for other types of architecture or other details. Remember, when we create these details, we want them as modular and reusable as possible. So anything that's already a specific shape in the geometry is going to be problematic because we wouldn't be able to take this and add it to a more angular arch, or wrap this around kind of a garden as a planter or something like that. Whereas these straight trim textures have plenty of variety. We could reuse these in countless number of ways in our town, saving on our production time and our texture memory. So we can get that same result using some of these flat textures. So I'm going to kind of make an arch that matches this shape in Max. And so a tool I hadn't used for a while is just the Arc tool under Splines. So you go to the Create tab, and instead of our standard primitives, you drop over to Shapes and choose Arc. And you click and drag to get the width of the arch. And you can snap to grid if you want to be more precise. But as you release, it'll pull up the arc up or down. So I feel like with this example, something like this kind of matches our proportions. And right away in our creation parameters over here, if you want it a little more rounded, you can go into interpolation and increase this. But before doing this, let's go into our rendering, and we want to enable in viewport and change it to rectangular. Remember, enable in viewport takes a spline and actually renders it. We could turn this into usable geometry. I'm going to just give this a darker color so we can see what it's looking like. Here we go. So it's still a spline. It's still an editable spline right now, but it at least renders in the viewport, so that allows us to go adjust these settings. So right now I changed it to rectangular, and we can give some thickness. A quick way to get that nice arc geometry. Now, even cooler than that, you can turn on generate mapping coordinates. Now that's going to give us a quick start to our UVs. So I'm going to load a base material. I'll load the placeholder one first. So go down to maps, click none, and we'll load up a bitmap. Remember, that's just a regular image. And go to our placeholder texture, this guy here. Go up to parent and turn it on in viewport so it shows up on our model. Now I can just apply this onto our model. Now it gives us UVs, but it doesn't give us much control over how the UVs look when we first create it. So we'd have to go into our editable poly settings. So we can just convert to edit poly. This is where we get all our modeling tools. I'm going to do a few things here. I'm going to delete the bottom faces and the backside. Most likely this would either be stitched into building geometry, or it would just be jammed in to save a little on try count. Okay, and let's give us some more geometry on the bottom. We can just shift drag edges. Remember, I prefer doing that. It's just a little cleaner than having to do weird extrusions and then deleting the additional geometry. And we will, still in edge mode. On this, I can actually just use my make planar to flatten that out. So I made planar on the y-axis, make that nice and clean. I might want a few extra edge loops in, so I'll do ring selections on both. Go to connect, and then we get an even amount. This just might come in handy for our smoothing later. Smoothing groups, or if you don't have enough geometry on long vertical areas, the lighting can give you some problems. Then I can flatten out these. Another old school trick of flattening verts out, you can just scale them down one axis. So I'm just kind of scaling on the Y, and it just goes down to a planar point and won't scale past that. And just on these ones back here, I'm going to manually drag these down, even though it kind of skews it a tad. I feel that'll be a smoother transition. So let's see what we have here. We go into Unwrap UVW, open our window, and we can turn on our details texture. Remember, the texture doesn't have to be visible. It's still applied, and the UVs are still would still work. Okay, so let's see what we have here. I deleted the backside, so it makes kind of selecting the important details a little more obvious. So basically, when you do an apply mapping, it gives you kind of a cylindrical map in the direction of the spline all the way around. So usually the back UVs were right here. It's all on a perfect square, but the proportions aren't necessarily correct on the UVs. So to change those, we'd go into checker pattern, and we would want to scale these UVs. And I'm just using freeform mode, so we can drag from the corner. And if I hold shift and scale up, basically I'm trying to decide which direction these need to be scaled for the resolution to get closer to a square. Now, sometimes, depending on the direction of your spline, you might decide you actually need to scale the other way. In this case, it distorts our texture density or textile density even more, so I need to make sure I'm going up. Now we notice another issue with the UVs. These are all equal proportions, but on our model, these are a lot more shallow on the ends here. So we can identify which rows are the problematic ones, and it's these ones. And we can fix those manually. So I'll select them and then scale those in. Remember, with UVs, you just want the proportions to be as close as to geometry proportions as possible to reduce distortion. Now this is looking a lot closer to the relationship between those UVs. And we can stitch this back together on this side. Let's see if that worked. Yeah, I used stitch to average as a way to stitch these UVs back together. These don't always work, but in this case it worked fine. Usually I try that before doing manual welding of the UVs. So that's pretty good. And you notice that we still have some distortion here. And let's bring up Josh's question. He was UVing his arch. He set up the textures correctly where they're in a flat line, but he's getting pinching up here due to how he set up his UVs. So by kind of doing it this way with basing it on a spline, you get the UVs wrapping around in the direction of the geometry easily. And then we can switch back to our details texture and scale these UVs to line up on whichever architectural details we like. This is kind of cool looking. Another nice thing about these trim textures is you might just move these around and find cool details you didn't anticipate. And that's that flexibility and reusability that I'm after. So that's nice as well. And this one has a couple miscellaneous details on here. But if I was doing a larger city project, I'd probably isolate all my trim textures to be all horizontal or vertical, so I can have a lot of variety by just sliding the UVs around like so. And remember, straighten that out. Remember, once we have our unwrap, if we want to go back to edit or to modeling, we can right click and collapse to. That drops the UV down. Of course, we still have our UV changes here. Then let's go over a couple other options you might want to do. We can add Swift loops based on how our texture looks. So this is the term I use called modeling from a texture, which is a very useful part of development, because a lot of times you have a huge material library of really well done materials and everyone's trying to share resources and get the game finished. So you want to have your textures as reusable as possible, and you want other people to be able to open them and apply it to their building. So that's when making modeling decisions based on what the materials and textures available look like. These skills are very valuable, and I feel like for students it's something naturally that they wouldn't have considered, really, just because it's kind of more of a development need, limitation, or whatever you want to call it. Here I'm just doing loop selections. Another cool thing I learned, you learn something new every day, but the chamfer setting, chamfer can be problematic depending on the geometry, but if you're just doing it on clean edge loops like this, it's really nice to round stuff off. But the thing I realized, notice the UVs are still intact. That's extremely valuable. So I'm adding nice chamfer on the bottom edges, rounding off these corners. And the UVs are intact. We have some smoothing groups issues, which I'll adjust in a second. And you can also, we can chamfer the inside kind of corners of things. So I'll do the same thing here. Go to my chamfer settings, and probably don't need that as much, but just a little bit. These are these types of things, these details here. I would make these decisions based on the context in game. So if this was a detail that's kind of at the bottom of our main building, it's kind of a focal point in the story that you walk right up to, then I'd go into this kind of detail. But if it's the top floor, of a building, I'm not gonna go in and chamfer these edges, and I wouldn't have this many segments on an arch. It also depends on how many arch windows are on a building. You kind of weigh all those decisions when you're making a model. And you're also, the nice thing about those decisions, none of them, the material and texture layout are independent from those decisions. So you can optimize or make them more detailed and the materials still work. The last thing I'm doing here, I'm selecting these outside edges, and I want a little bit of a flare, kind of taper to these. So if you just scale them, you see the issue, they're kind of scaling together. But if I want it to flare out, we can switch this selection to vertex. So I converted selections by holding Control and clicking vertice. And then I can use the push modifier to a specific selection. So we can push that out. Convert back to edit poly. Now that's kind of looking a little more polished. But after doing some of the chamfers, we have some hard edges from our smoothing groups. So we can remedy that just by selecting all the polys with Control A, dropping down to smoothing groups, and I'll do a clear all. And first we can do auto smooth at 45 degrees. Basically anything within 45 degrees angle difference will smooth together. So that's a good kind of default. If something's like a hard edge 90-degree angle, it'll be a chiseled smoothing group. So that's an example here. This is shading separately because that angle difference is more than 45. So if I wanted to fix that, I can manually select that ring, hold Control, and switch to face selection. I could clear the smoothing groups just from that selection, and I could give these their own smoothing group. So I could give it 7. Now that little piping has its own smoothing. Okay, now I'm going to take this model here and I'll apply it to one of our more final materials. Remember, this is just a placeholder texture. So it's called Arc1. Save it and merge it into my export file. So this is the working building that we're using in class. So I'll go to import merge. Remember, import merge is when you're just wanting to merge over other max files. So I can bring that arch over. Here it is. And this file's already set up for export. So I'm just going to apply the material, the export material, the cryogen material to this object. And I need to set its material ID to match our details material. And because I laid my high poly details out in the same order as my placeholder, these UVs should already line up anyway. It's kind of an advantage of that workflow. And then we can, in our export list under utilities, we see the main body of this building is selected up here, and everything else is just linked to it. So with this arch, I can use select and link. And that lets us just have things separate. For instance, all these objects are just separate individual pieces. These windows are instances. And that's a nice way to work. So you don't have to, collapse everything and stitch it together. You can keep things separate as you're working on it. It's going to be a lot more user-friendly. So still, we only need one, the kind of parent in the export list. You can export nodes. Hop over to CryEngine. You should see the arch. And this material that looks kind of best when you get some glancing angles on the sun coming over, a lot of the definition will start showing up. So that's a technique for arches. You can, pretty much handle any kind of archway with this technique. You can use less segments if it's something you're going to repeat more often. Yeah, and this is an example of just that flat material. You can pretty much use this on any type of building. So I hope that helps, and look forward to more of these little kind of quick videos.